So what I'd really like to sort of cover is we're getting fed this cloud message, right? And we kind of have to sort of understand it as an all-up strategy, where different parts of it fit in. I think early on the idea was that, we're going to release this cloud infrastructure, and then people were just going to migrate in droves over to it, and that sort of didn't happen, right? So what had come from that is an idea of this hybrid environment where you had your on-prem environment and you also had your cloud environment. And where those two sort of meet is what we're going to be talking about today. So is anyone currently using 2007 or 2010 in a true stretch farm scenario? Okay, so we'll talk about what that means and what it is. So let's go over a few top level things. Some of this might be review, but it all builds on top of each other, so we'll kind of go through it. If you have any questions throughout, please just ask. I'd much rather talk about what you'd like to talk about versus a bunch of slides. All right, so here's my idea of how this whole cloud thing works out. We're getting fed this message of cloud. We don't really even understand which cloud we're talking about, when. There's different pieces of it, different providers. Really, at the end of the day, this is the best way I could sum it up, right? So when you talk about like a full cloud scenario where you're doing Office 365 or SharePoint Online, you have an apartment, basically, or a flat, right? So you have just one space. It's connected to all these other tenants. You can't really do a whole lot. You can paint the walls. You can add some pictures, but you're not knocking down any walls. You're not putting in a breakfast nook. It's pretty much set the way it is, right? You might have a pet or two. Private cloud is this concept of, so you have a full installation of SharePoint, but you don't own it. You're giving a slice of it. You pay into it, but you're still connected to other folks as well. So you have that condo, townhome style living, right? And then on-prem or hybrid, it's, full on. Wherever you want to go, wherever you want to live, whatever you want to do to your house, that's where you have the most amount of flexibility. And we're going to be talking a lot about this last scenario here and what it all means for hybrid and what it means for stretch farms, well, a pseudo stretch farm, really. So quickly, what is full cloud? So full cloud is everything is environmentally off-site. So it's in SharePoint Online, it's in Office 365 or some other provider. You don't own it, you don't touch it. It's only you have access to it, you pay into it. It's subscription-based versus license-based. That may be a good or bad thing depending on what your model is and how much money you want to actually spend. You don't have to really do anything anymore. You kind of just go there and start using it, right? So traditionally, on-prem has been, you have to maintain it, you have to patch it, upgrade it, bring it through these different scenarios throughout the life cycle of that environment and that data. Now it's just start using it, do whatever you kind of want to do. Hopefully you have some kind of governance around it, but at the end of the day, you can just, have access to it and you don't really have to do much about it. Hopefully, there's no more upgrades. There hasn't been anything come down the pipe that way. Since there's a little bit of confusion on how to get your current on-prem data into SharePoint Online, and then vice versa, how to actually share content across those two environments, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well. So private cloud, like I said, is typically, there's different variations of it, but it's typically a full on-prem deployment somewhere, right? So a lot of the example that I use back home is a lot of these government agencies, they'll host a large farm at the top of that agency, and then the subsidiary consuming agencies below that. Let's say Department of Justice has a huge SharePoint environment, and then like the FBI might have a tenant of that environment or a site collection of that environment. And they usually backbill it. So based on consumption, based on how much usage, they'll pay back up into the system for DOJ, and that'll keep the whole system running, right? So they pay into it for support and maintenance and that sort of thing. They're usually huge, obviously, because they have to support that entire infrastructure below it. Depending on how big those agencies are or how big the tenants have to be, that sort of dictates how large that farm is going to be. There's a whole bunch of different variations of this. Sometimes it doesn't even have to be on-prem. This can be sort of like off-site, like an FP web or Rackspace, or even Azure can do this sort of thing. So it all depends on where you're going to have that data actually live. All right, so I just skipped ahead like 3 slides, 1 second. So hybrid cloud, this full cloud scenario, it's a much more complicated topic, much more complicated to talk about within an hour. There's different sections of full cloud, at least when you talk about Azure, right? So there's PaaS, there's IaaS, and there's SaaS. Those are sort of the top level verticals in which most things are organized within something like Azure. So IaaS, for example, would be something like Hyper-V or VMware running in Azure. So instead of having a host machine on site, you have an Azure account and you just turn on VMs just as frequently or infrequently as you need to. You pay based on consumption and based on resources, but at the end of the day, you have full access to create as many as you want to actually pay for. Let's see if this thing will actually work. So that's kind of my idea of where these different levels of hybrid and different levels of interaction with SharePoint as we're going forward sort of lie, right? So that's sort of the groundwork. So what I like to talk about going into this is a lot of people are looking at hybrid as sort of a scenario to bridge the gap to sort of tiptoe into cloud or tiptoe into getting users used to going to different URLs to do their job. I think that one of the things that is sort of lacking with this whole conversation is where else can we use a hybrid scenario? So back in 2010, 2007, we had this scenario of stretch farms. So does anyone know what a stretch farm is? Just throw it out there with me. Not you, you. Go ahead. So, the gentleman in front of you, yes. Yeah. Stretch farm, what do you think?
So we have 2 data centers in the UK, and we stretch farm across 2 data centers.
Okay.
There are 2 requirements to fulfill. The latency should be less than millisecond.
Right. So are they both in the UK? Right, okay. So I get to give you stuff, which is really cool. So you either get an Xbox 360 hat or a really sweet Texas mouse pad. This looks like it'd be a lot of fun to throw, so you should definitely pick this one so I can throw it. Ah, you went with the hat, okay. Hand that off, thank you. All right, so, he said a couple key things there, right? Really key things that drive this whole message of why this should be possible and why we should be thinking about this. 2 things. One, has to be less than 1 millisecond latency between those 2 data centers, between that wire, which is, they have to be down the street, connected by fiber, basically, right? And the other thing is they're in the same place, right? So the original concept of why I think a lot of people use stretch farm was, you stretch to somewhere like Southeast Asia where the bandwidth is terrible, right? So you have large offices, let's say, in Singapore or Australia or whatever it might be, and your home center might be UK, right? So being able to get good response time to the folks down in Southeast Asia to get to your SharePoint farm was pretty bad, trying to send them over the wire. So what people would do is they would have a stretch farm where they'd have some servers in the UK and physically some servers in Southeast Asia. And depending on where they were going or where they were hitting the environment from, that would be the SharePoint servers that they would hit. So the idea was to decrease the amount of latency for that round trip for someone to hit the SharePoint sites, get their data, and come back. So that data was informationally mirrored between those 2. So you'd have one set of database clusters. They'd be all joined to the same farm. So it's really just one big farm just in many different locations. Well, when 2013 came out, originally they said no stretch farms, period. We're not going to be able to do it because there's a whole lot of technical reasons as to why it's very difficult to do stretch farms in 2013. But they later came out with like the March public update and said, okay, if you have March public update, the very first patch basically, you can do stretch farms, but the requirement for supportability was less than 1 millisecond of latency between those 2 points, which again is, I mean, they have to be within the same like city, country at the most. So at the end of the day, you just can't do it, right? Is really what it comes down to for practical reasons, other than you just have 2 data centers that you need to take use of, and you can split them up in the same location. Otherwise, you're just not going to do it, right? Or you can do it, but you couldn't call someone like me saying, hey, SharePoint's slow, we need you to come out and fix it. And then I get there and realize it's a stretch farm in 2 different countries, and millisecond latency is 100, right? So at the end of the day, my thought process on this whole conversation was going to be around how can we use SharePoint Online and SharePoint On-Prem as a stretch farm, right? Because the good thing about SharePoint Online is that it's geographically dispersed by nature. It's in many different data centers, I think like 14 or so as of right now, and then I know that they're actively building 3 more.
Well, I understood if you sign up for Office 365 or SharePoint Online that you have to pick a data center. So if you put it...
No, so depending on where you are, so you can pick a data center. So there's requirements that a lot of government agencies have to make sure that they know physically where their data is, right? So if that's the case, then yes. But still, depending on where that user is accessing SharePoint from, or SharePoint Online from, they're going to be routed to the closest DNS server to whatever data center that they're closest to, okay? So at the end of the day, they're still getting good response time. However, their data just lives in one place. So if you don't fall in that scenario, then your data is geo-replicated, all over, right? So the idea there is using multiple different Microsoft products to be able to bridge that gap of latency is really what it comes down to. So here's, as of today, physically online where there are data centers within the world. And I know that there's at least 3 more coming on site here soon that they're actively building. So jumping back from that for just a second, was there a question? Yeah.
There's no actual stretch farm used in SharePoint. One farm, it's just the entry point that you're getting benefit of.
Right. Yep. You can still do stretch farms in 2013, but again, I mean, you have such a very small margin of latency requirements that.
Would it work if we just stretch the content databases and not the others?
No, they would still have, whatever point to point has to be, there's a test latency for less than a millisecond to make sure that, I mean, you can do it. There's nothing to say, but you can also go into the database and edit it manually, but it just doesn't mean that you should, right? So you can do it, but supportability-wise, they wouldn't support it. So jumping back from that for just a second, taking the stretch farm scenario out of play for just 1 second, yeah?
I know in Office 365 Microsoft is using CDN.
Using what?
Static content. For static content, they're using CDN.
Right.
Are they using CDN for dynamic content as well?
That's a good question.
Looking for ADN as well, application.
I don't know. Do you have any idea?
All the JS and CSS files and all the images are using spo.microsoftonline.com something.
Right.
It's using CDN. When you bake it, you get the GAMI CDN. I'm not sure about the content.
So maybe the demo will answer some of those questions, because I can show you where I ping and then what I sort of get from that ping, and depending on what location I'm actually in. So again, going back to taking the stretch farm scenario out of play for just a second, why would you want to go hybrid? Forget being able to geographically disperse your environment across the world. There's a couple different questions that you have to come up with answers to be able to understand, okay, if this is the right thing for me, and then if it is, there's multiple channels to actually take once you go into that. So the previous session, I'm sure Miguel was talking about outbound, inbound, and two-way hybrid federation. So depending on some of these answers that you're going to get from this is going to dictate whether or not you're actually going to choose one of those different paths. And then based on one of those paths is the difference, and this is where it becomes critical, the difference in user experience that you're going to get as a result of choosing one of those methods. Okay, so just a quick example while you guys sort of read this on your own. if a user or if an organization chooses outbound only, so outbound meaning only people on-prem can access their own SharePoint Online environment using their authentication. But if you shared your external SharePoint Online site to someone external of your organization, they wouldn't then automatically have rights to come back into your on-prem. That's what outbound means. Okay, so just your internal users can go outbound. Inbound is basically the opposite. I have yet to see a use case where anyone does that, where they just have external users who are not part of your org come in. I don't know why you'd want to do that, but it's technically possible. And then you have two-way, where it's basically anyone can jump from any side. Now, again, based on which direction you choose will dictate what the user experience is. So true single sign-on, meaning they log into their machine or they log in one time and they're never prompted again. If that's a scenario that has to be in play, then you have to go two-way. There's no other way around it. Untrue single sign-on, or like browser cached sign-on, basically meaning they log in one time, their browser keeps that login information until it times out, and they can go back and forth and forever until that session times out, and then they'd have to log in again. So if that's a choice that's actually in play, then you're looking at maybe just outbound, and in this case, it would be technically easier to set up hybrid in that case. So there's a lot of different choices that you have to make, and the water's a little bit muddy to try to figure that out, but hopefully, at the end of these next couple sessions, you'll be able to figure that out. So like I just talked about, these are the three different methods that you can use for hybrid. So we talked about the latency requirements. This is literally the quote from TechNet. There's a highly consistent intra-farm latency of less than 1 millisecond one way 99% of the time. So it's basically not going to happen. Again, unless literally those two data centers are, 20, 30 miles apart or something like that. So we talk about, all right, so how can we use SharePoint Online as a stretch farm, and sort of what sort of things that we have to think about latency-wise in our environment to make sure that all happens. And I'll show you some of the tricks that actually go into checking for your current latency, checking for what your latency is for SharePoint Online, and then sort of balling that up and making sure that users can get to where they need to when they need to. Any questions so far? Okay, so these are the features that you get with a two-way federated hybrid environment. Okay, so you get true single sign-on. The social features come along. BCS, as of right now, I think still needs to be nested within an app. I'm not sure if that's still the case. It was a couple months ago. All the Office clients features that come with your normal traditional SharePoint on-prem environment. Some of the benefits that you get from it, there's going to be limited configuration depending on which method you choose. It's obviously scalable, right? So you basically just throw money at it, right? And it scales as far as you want. So on-prem is kind of the same way. So if you needed to scale up or scale out, you either added resources to a box or you added a whole another box to the environment to make sure that you met that scale. With SharePoint Online, it's, okay, you have more users that you're onboarding, you're buying more subscriptions, the service as a whole will scale automatically regardless of how many users you actually have hitting it. So you don't actually have to do anything to make sure that it scales correctly. Sure.
Does it mean that if I have an AD account and I have a domain client PC I'm accessing SharePoint Online from, I will see that page to log into Office 365?
It depends. So the question was, if I'm using single sign-on, true single sign-on I'm taking, and I have a local PC and I'm accessing SharePoint Online, do I never see the logon prompts? So if you're using true single sign-on, no, you wouldn't see it. So if you logged in at your workstation at work, that account that you're using to log in and accredit to that machine would be the same credentials that would be passed on to SharePoint Online when you access that URL. So the replication of that account and those credentials that's happening behind the scenes when a synchronization for that user account's happening takes care of those credentials and passing them on. If
Is that an ADFS requirement?
Yes, yep. Now, if you did not do true single sign-on and you wanted to not have to do all the ADFS stuff and all the certificate signing and just trust and all that stuff that you have to do, which it sounds like a whole lot, but it's really not. It's maybe a couple hours worth of work. And you had untrue single sign-on in that you clicked on that link from your user machine and you were going off to SharePoint Online, you would be presented with the logon one time. And then as long as the browser kept those credentials, you would be able to access it. Yeah, good question. So let's talk about Azure and where Azure sort of falls into this. I never do sales pitches in my talks, but this is one of the things that I'm sort of passionate about, like by proxy, I guess. It's one of the only things I've been truly excited about in a really long time. Just Azure as a whole and what that actually means for SharePoint. I know AWS is very, very close. I know that they have a little bit better pricing on storage, but I don't think that the feature set is the same or as robust as it is in Azure. So you sort of, like, is price more important or features more important when you're making those decisions? At the end of the day, I don't have to pay for it, so I get access to it, and it's a lot of fun. But what does that mean for SharePoint, especially in this case? So there's this additional concept of just hybrid environments and cloud environments where instead of having your SharePoint servers on-prem or in your own data centers, let's say you're a new company or you're an older company that's sort of moving physical locations and you're selling the whole lot and you don't want to bring the data center over, you don't want to build a new one, you could, in theory, move your workloads to Azure. So what that means, going back to that IaaS conversation, is the same way you would stand up servers on VMware or Hyper-V, you stand them up in Azure. It's slightly a bit different. You can script most of it, which is kind of nice. There's APIs behind everything. You can build servers on the fly. You don't need to actually console into anything, ever even go into the portal if you don't want to. But what that actually means is now you have the same benefits of SharePoint Online where you're geo-redundant, but now everything's in Azure, and that's also geo-redundant depending on how much you want to pay, right, obviously. And there's a whole suite of things that come along with that service with things that you would have had to do on-prem separately. So disaster recovery, high availability, scaling up versus scaling out is so much easier in Azure or in AWS than it is on-prem. So it might be something to think about, especially if the hardest sell for companies is looking at the initial price tag. But if you think about it in the context of how much goes along with owning a data center or building a data center, it makes a whole lot of sense over the long term, right? So if you think about air conditioning costs, lease for hardware costs that renew every 3 years, licensing costs, physical work force to man those data centers, all the stuff that goes along with it, standing things up in Azure within 30 minutes seems like a really good trade-off. So if you're interested, I know I have a little slide about this tomorrow, or about tomorrow. I have a session on SharePoint disaster recovery in Azure using Azure Site Recovery, which, if I can get the demo working, is going to be really sweet. So I would definitely check it out if you can make it tomorrow. It's like, I think it's actually at this time slot in this room tomorrow. Anyway, so within Azure, you have a couple different ways to go about this. So there's different tiers, and they basically just mean different levels of resources that go into the cost in which it costs for you to run them. So basic, standard, enterprise are the tier levels of VMs that you can run. So basic meaning essentially shared processors and very low RAM, all the way up to enterprise and premium stuff, which is using like SSDs and a lot of other fast connections that obviously cost more, but will give you the performance that you need. Over the last 5 months, every single time that AWS has announced decreases in cost, Microsoft basically said, yeah, we'll drop the cost too. So as more people get on this bandwagon of cloud and bringing those resources to market, I think the prices overall are going to continue to go down. This is really cool. This is something that's available within Azure. So ExpressRoute and site-to-site VPN. We'll talk more about those tomorrow if you care to join, but essentially what it means is being able to extend your on-prem network to Azure to the point where there's almost zero latency. So it depends on which one you pick. ExpressRoute costs a good bit of money from your ISP. Site-to-site VPN is no real cost. It's certificates and domain stuff. The latency is a little bit different there, but being able to extend your network comes in really handy when you're thinking about this whole concept of stretch farming, because depending on where those servers live, they can still be on the same network. Again, geo-dispersed across the globe, being able to hit those servers based on where you are, getting the best latency. Okay, one of the good things in Azure now is you can long-term lease an IP, which you're not actually doing either. You're basically reserving an IP address from the Azure pool. But what that really means is now you can run, well, you could for a long time, but you can easily run your domain controllers within Azure as well and turn them off if you need to. So let's say in a disaster recovery type situation, you have everything off and you have something like Azure Site Recovery or one of the other features that are available within Azure to turn everything back on as it realizes there's no connectivity to the original farm. So let's say your on-prem environment goes down, there's a fire, there's no air conditioning in a data center, there's a sewage leak. All these things I've actually seen while on site, always fun. Something goes down basically and you can't get to your on-prem environment. You can spin up everything in Azure almost immediately. It takes maybe 3 minutes or so to turn on a SharePoint farm in order. But you'll also have your domain controllers with static IP addresses so that when all those things come on, everything can talk to each other. So if this wasn't the case, and this wasn't the case all the time in Azure prior, if you ever turned off your DCs, your SharePoint farm couldn't talk to each other because basically that virtual IP gets reconsumed by another Azure box that's getting spun up. So now everything could talk to each other in real time. You don't have to worry about turning things off, and as a result, you can keep costs really low because nothing's actually running until you need to. So again, I talked about tomorrow, the old Azure Badger is going to come out tomorrow and talk about Azure Site Recovery. So there's a couple different ways. The easiest way is to configure basically, what is it? I'm drawing a blank on the name of the service, System Center, right? So if you had System Center up in your on-prem environment, you can set up some policies to basically communicate back to Azure. So depending on which method of disaster recovery you chose, because there's a couple different ways to do it in Azure, like always on, log shipping, like the traditional stuff that you could do, and then things like Azure Site Recovery, which is monitoring that heartbeat. So if that heartbeat doesn't happen for X period of time over X, range, or if, or even things cool like if you see a spike in processing consumption on your on-prem environment, you can spin up other ones in Azure to take that load over. So a lot of that heartbeat is managed by different processes in Azure or on-prem. So System Center, there's a configuration manager server that gets configured within Azure Site Recovery if you use that method. And then, like Traffic Manager can do a lot of that stuff too. So it depends is the best way I can really answer that question. It depends on the scenario and depends on how much money you want to spend, really. So if you were in the session prior, right at the end when I came in, you guys were talking about hybrid search, two-way hybrid search, right? So this whole thing is sort of painting a picture of, okay, I can get most of the user experience that I'm traditionally used to getting on-prem on SharePoint Online or vice versa, or to the point where the user doesn't even really know or care where they are at any given time in your environment. So trying to make sure all these experiences are the same across, depending which environment they're actually hitting, is sort of the goal. So we'll talk about search real quick, what that actually means for hybrid. Again, depending on the method that you choose, inbound, outbound, two-way is going to dictate where someone can do a search and the results that they're going to get back. So just really quickly, if you're outbound only, then users will only, from the internal side, they would have to go to both locations to get the result sets from either or. So they couldn't just do, let's say, a search on-prem to get the results from SharePoint Online as well as on-prem, okay? They would have to do a search on-prem and then say, oh, I don't see the results I need, and then they go online and they get the results that they might need. So that's a little bit confusing, right? Because they don't really care at the end of the day if it's branded all the same where they're actually going, or might even not know, depending on the skill level of the user. So inbound being the exact opposite, only it'd be external users. They wouldn't be able to even get in if it didn't matter anyway, so they'd have to do their searches externally anyway. But then there's two-way. Doesn't matter where that user is, if they hit the search center internally or externally, or if you have them mapped together, doesn't matter, they'll get the same results set regardless of where they are, and that's what we're going to be talking about here. So there's a lot that actually happens with hybrid search to make this all happen, and I'm going to show you how that works behind the scenes to give you a little bit of understanding. If you're familiar with search and the infrastructure behind search, this will make a lot of sense, but hopefully visually, for those who aren't, this will make sense too. So there's this concept of rehydration, right? So SharePoint is always permission trimmed. It's permission aware. So who that person is dictates what they can see, right? And you don't just want to not have that regardless of where the user is, because they might get access to things that they shouldn't be seeing. So this rehydration process happens where basically SharePoint on-prem is passing off who that user is to SharePoint Online. SharePoint Online processes all that and then decides what to actually show to that user. So it permission trims that result set based on that information that it's getting from on-prem, or online for that matter. So how does this happen? So we have our user down here. He's about to make a search query, and this is sort of the process that actually goes through. So they do an on-prem search center query that will get sent off to the on-prem processing component. That processing component then shoves it over to the index components, or basically where that index is stored, and we'll cycle through that information to find out what that user actually has access to, and permission trims that and then sends the results back based on what that user actually is querying. Where this would normally keep going back to the user if it was just on-prem gets paused. So it's held sort of in limbo, in memory state at this moment. And then that same query is actually sent up to the SharePoint Online processing component. And that's where this whole rehydration process takes place. So SharePoint Online will say, okay, who is this user? Let me find out who they are. It's get that information sent up from the user profile service on-prem to the actual user profile service that's running behind the scenes that you don't see happening in SharePoint Online. That information gets pulled in. It says, okay, I know who this user is. I know what they would have access to. Sent off to the indexing component, brings back those result sets, shoves that all back down to the original location, and then sends that over to the query page and then back to the user. So that's actually what's happening behind the scenes when you have a two-way search hybrid environment set up. And essentially what that will come down to, let me skip this page real quick, is a result set that looks like this, at least as of a couple weeks ago. So if you're familiar with 2007 and federated search, this is very similar, where you actually, in that case, you had your original result set and then a web part that would have tertiary queries that you did from other locations through RSS or whatever. It's not handled the same way, but the display is very similar as of, again, a couple weeks ago, where you get a split view of what that actually is. Now, I know that they said they're working on trying to mesh those, but if you think about it, it's a very, very hard thing to do. You're basically meshing results from two different locations that have different weight values, and then sending them back to a user, taking those combined weighted values based on what that user is actually searching on and what's relevant in the organization, and deciding where to actually show them in order. So I imagine that's a pretty technical, difficult thing that they're actually working through. So hopefully we see it. But that's what you're actually looking at when you have that. So we actually talked about this already, so we're good there. So let's get to a little bit of the meat of the situation here. Let's talk about bandwidth and latency and what this all means for hybrid environments. Any questions going in? I think we're doing pretty good on time. Okay. So we'll talk about two things, bandwidth and latency. Bandwidth being the size of the internet pipe that you have available to you, and then latency being the length of time that it takes to communicate from one point to another. So basically, the more money you spend on bandwidth, the faster SharePoint Online is going to react. Has nothing to do with SharePoint Online, has everything to do with on-prem bandwidth, right? So if you have, I don't know what you guys have over here, if you have like ADSL or T1 or something like that for an entire organization of 10,000 people, SharePoint Online might not be the fastest thing in the world, but neither will pretty much anything that you're trying to get to on the internet anyway. So a lot of that will actually dictate speed. And one of the things that we come across a lot in Premiere is performance issues with SharePoint Online. When we get on site, we actually do a lot of fact checking and finding out, okay, what's the bandwidth latency actually look like? And most of the time it ends up being that there's just not enough pipe to support what they're trying to access in SharePoint Online and have the speed results that they feel they should be getting. Right, so if you think about it, there's a lot of stuff going on in SharePoint Online, a lot of queries happening, a lot of permission trimming happening on render of that page, and it takes time depending on how long that pipe or how big that pipe is going to dictate how long the results are actually going to get back to you. So one of the things that people are actually very interested to find is rendering of web pages is actually pretty small in terms of how much bandwidth consumption actually takes. Through the UI of SharePoint Online, uploading and downloading of documents is kind of middle of the road. That's where most of the consumption takes place. It's where most of users are interacting with SharePoint as just a default of what SharePoint is. It's a document repository at the end of the day. It's where it started. That's the most usage that you actually get from any kind of SharePoint environment is just uploading and downloading of documents. What people are interested to find is that doing like OneDrive for Business syncs or desktop syncs is actually the part that takes up the most consumption. And this is one of the things that have to be sort of planned, and one of the things that bites a lot of people when they turn on SharePoint Online and they turn on syncing, because they don't understand where this actually plays in and how much consumption it actually is. So what is actually happening when you have the desktop client doing the synchronization of files up to SharePoint Online or up to OneDrive is it can only do 5 files at a time, and it can only do 3.5 megs of that file per thread. Okay, that might mean nothing, but if you think about it, if you turn on all at one time, let's say one day you just turn on, you push down like the client sync app, people start using SharePoint Online, and like Monday morning they come in and they say, oh, I have all this new stuff, and they start syncing all these files up to SharePoint, right, up to OneDrive. Imagine the bandwidth consumption of an entire organization pushing hundreds of files, megs and gigs of files, all up to the cloud through your pipe at one time, right? So this is probably the one area that needs to be throttled, and how you throttle that is basically how often you bring new users up into SharePoint Online when you push that sync app down to those client machines. Right? So that'll dictate how much upfront bandwidth consumption there actually is when you push that down. So that's probably the one thing you have to stagger when you're bringing folks up onto SharePoint Online for the first time. There's a couple of different ways to find out what that consumption rate's going to be. Luckily for you, the product group has provided an Excel document. I almost got that out without laughing. But yeah, there's an Excel doc that you can actually go and download and find out relatively what you think your consumption is going to be that first day. Baselining your bandwidth internally will sort of dictate what how much consumption rate is going to be based on the Excel document that you come up with a number to be able to understand, okay, Monday morning, this is what I think the number is going to be. This is what my internal bandwidth pipe is going to be, and this is what I think the result of that's actually going to be. So you're going to understand, okay, this is going to be a lot slower, this is going to be much, much faster than I thought it was going to be. So understanding where that baseline is, again, lets you decide how often to stagger users in or to not stagger them in at all. Right? If you have 60 users and they have, I don't know, a gig worth of data each, that's probably not enough to stagger anybody, just turn it on. But if you have a couple 100,000 users, that's obviously an issue. So latency. Latency is the time between the ping, right? So how long does my request go out until it comes back, that round trip time, which is really important, right? So this is where, depending on where that user is physically located, is going to dictate what the user experience for pages rendering and that sort of thing actually going to come back, or the request of which. So in Office 365, all the DNS servers are geographically dispersed. So wherever you are in the world, you can ping outlook.office365.com and find out which DNS server you're actually hitting. And during this demo and doing the prep work, I was obviously in Texas doing it the first time, and I would hit one DNS server, and when I come out actually over here to do the same demo and walk through and test, I'm hitting different DNS servers. So I know that based on where I am in any given location, I'm going to get the most speedy results as a result of that GEO-DNS replication. The other thing that you'll actually see, so if you do a lot of VPNing for customer or for your employees, so think about this, right? I mean, it's very logical once someone actually goes ahead and says what's actually happening. VPN is you're extending your network to wherever that user is. So that user, if let's say they're in Southeast Asia and they're VPNing into the UK, then the DNS that they're going to be hitting is the UK, right? So now they're negating the entire point of using SharePoint Online and being geo-dispersed by using a VPN. So, indeed, right, exactly. So that's one of the things you'll have to take into play. So this story really does not evolve around just the SharePoint admin. This revolves around the network admins. This revolves around your SQL DBAs. This is a big sort of undergoing that has to take place to make sure that basically no one comes back and complains about speed. The other thing that you can sort of play into this same topic would be that ExpressRoute or site-to-site VPN conversation that we had a little bit earlier. So here's how I normally find out the health in which an organization is hitting SharePoint Online. Okay, so there's a couple different tools that I use and a couple different methods that I use. So I'll either use, my preference is Wireshark, but you can use Netmon, any one of these, right? And I'll run a trace against SharePoint Online or Office 365 and find the A record IP. Once I have that A record IP, there's a tool in sysinternals called psping, right? So you download psping, you pass in that IP, and you'll get the average millisecond latency of that user at that place hitting that GEO-DNS site, right? So wherever they are, it doesn't matter. this is going to be localized results to that user. So this works really well if you're in like headquarters and you can sort of understand that, okay, based on this process, my average is going to be about 16 milliseconds for almost everyone in the company. That might go up 2 or 3 milliseconds depending on where they sit, how far they are, whatever. This would then have to be done maybe at that satellite office to understand again what is their latency requirements. The interesting thing that sometimes I just don't understand how this all works. SharePoint Online works well, is what the documentation reads, up to 300-ish milliseconds of latency. It doesn't say ish, I added ish, but up to 300 milliseconds, which is interesting considering that the requirement for on-prem is less than a millisecond. So I'll let you take from that what you want. Other tools that you can use to basically do the same thing. HTTP Watch, you can see what that traffic actually looks like. Fiddler, obviously, we've all used Fiddler to see what that traffic actually looks like. So there's a lot of ways to narrow down where any bottlenecks might actually be in your environment to, again, get that true feeling of no matter where I am, if I'm hitting SharePoint Online from a link inside of SharePoint on-prem, that I'm getting fast results no matter where I actually am located. This story actually gets even deeper when you think about being able to offload entire workloads or entire sets of data to locations where they don't physically need to be connected to the on-prem environment, but they can physically exist within that SharePoint Online environment. So for example, let's say that same scenario of Southeast Asia customers or employees, they need access to a subset of that data. Well, in theory, it'd be fairly easy, depending on what the requirements are around that data, to offload that set to just SharePoint Online. So they still have access to get back and do searches and do whatever they need to do on-prem, but their SharePoint Online data is going to be the most accessible at the fastest speed if you offset that work to that SharePoint Online site. So depending on what you can get away with and where you can push sites around, that's not as easily said than done, right? So there's a huge migration process that has to happen most often. If you're timing that with an upgrade, that can get very complicated, but it's at least something to think about when you're going down that road. Any questions so far? We got 5-10 minutes. Not for just questions, I have more, but.
You mentioned, going back to the question I had earlier, so you mentioned that from SharePoint Online, so if you're using in London, using it in Tokyo, if they ping Office 365, they will get a local DNS server.
Right.
So if they're uploading content, where is that farm sitting? Where they get the DNS, but where's the web front end? Where's the SQL server? Surely that's in one DC. That's where the sub-farm is.
Right. So the question is, depending on where that user is and they're uploading data, which site, which web front end, database, and all that are they actually hitting? So it depends on where they're uploading data to. So if you're part of one hybrid environment, so you have on-prem and you have SharePoint Online, in theory, they see it as one, even though they're actually changing URLs and there's some different things going on and different hops going on. But if they're uploading data to SharePoint Online, then they're truly updating it to the closest data center that they have.
So the SharePoint Online farm itself is spread just as much as everything else.
Yeah.
So there is a context to stretch farms on SharePoint Online.
In context, right. So if they're uploading to SharePoint on-prem, then obviously they're going to go all the way back to the UK.
Obviously, whatever the SharePoint Online farm is, that's overcome the limitations that we see with on-premise. So you can have farms with web front ends in multiple geographic locations and everything else.
So you don't see them as a web front end. You don't see them as a physical server. They're just seeing it as a location to upload to. The physical on-prem web front ends, app servers, database servers, they still live in your on-prem environment. Now that's different if it's Azure, different story. But if you're just extending your on-prem environment, then they're uploading it to all the way back here, basically. Make sense? Clear as mud? Follow up with me? Yeah, okay. All right, so quickly going through, I actually still have a demo. I don't know how I feel bad for you guys because you get a fire hose of an hour worth of conversation that should be like an hour and a half conversation. So where do I want to go with this one? So these are some of the things that you're going to want to try to do with your, when you're uploading stuff to SharePoint Online, right? So these are some of the things you can do to lessen that workload, lessen the amount of work that actually goes into it. At the end of the day, the more stuff you have on SharePoint pages in SharePoint Online is going to be how slow it is, right? That's just the fact of the matter. We all sort of understand that since the dawn of internet, right? One thing that people don't always think about is how many nested navigation nodes they choose to show, right? This is the #1 killer of most SharePoint performance sites when it's localized to just a page or maybe a subsite. It's very easy to check that box to say, yes, I want to see more drop-downs in my navigation. But what people don't understand is happening is, again, SharePoint is permission trimmed, so everything that it chooses to show has to be accessed and checked against what that user's permission actually is. So if you have 5 flyouts for every single sub-navigation, SharePoint had to check all 5 of those times 60 or times 100 to actually show what that user has access to. If they don't even have access to see that that page exists or that site exists or data in that site exists, the more granular you have that navigation structure, the slower the page will react. It has to do more to make sure that page can render. So the higher up you can keep that navigation, or if you can offload that to like manage metadata navigation or something like that, the faster your page will ultimately load. Now, obviously, there's a whole bunch of other stuff that goes in that. Are you streaming a video from that page? Are you, downloading like the world's most awesome looking look and feel that has a million images, tons of JavaScript and that sort of thing, which is where mimification of jQuery and JavaScript stuff comes into play. CDNs, where you can offload some of that data to, again, geographically dispersed locations. So if you have libraries that you're accessing different jQuery libraries from, to then render and show the page in any given way or do something specific on that page, that all takes bandwidth. That's all consumption, right? So being able to offload where that code is actually stashed, Microsoft has available these CDN networks that you can actually use. Okay, I'm going to show you a really quick demo. It's literally like 5 minutes because that's all I have. All right. Okay, so the very first thing, you can't see any of that, can you? All right, so somehow we went back to extended. Hold on one second. Okay, so finding out where you actually are is like the step 1. Finding out which DNS you're actually hitting. So if I just do a quick ping, I can see, let me drop this font size up a little bit. Yeah, that's much more readable. Sorry. Anyway, so you can see that I'm hitting basically EMEA West, right? So that's the location of my DNS. This was different when I was back in the States, and it's different when I go to Seattle. It's different when I go to Singapore, whatever. It's a different DNS depending on where I'm actually located. So from this step, you're going down that road of PS ping, finding out what your latencies are, and then doing your compressions and that sort of thing. One other really cool trick is finding out what the load times or the request times are for your SharePoint Online pages. They're all different, right? So they'll be different based on what's actually in them, what the health of that page actually is, or the health of that site. Does anyone remember that whole health ranking thing that we had new in 2010 that didn't make any sense whatsoever, right? So you had a site health ranking of like 1 to 10, 10 being the worst, 0 being the best, and somewhere you didn't really understand the difference between a 4 and a 6. It didn't really matter a whole lot. But at the end of the day, the closer you were to 10, the worse you were. So SharePoint Online sites have that as well. But the thing is, based on what that loaded time is actually being required of that page or that site, what the response time is, how many people are hitting it, SharePoint Online reacts accordingly and will offset that to multiple workloads to sort of backfill that requirement of need of people hitting that site. So that if you ever, for whatever reason, see that the health of that site is high, doing nothing whatsoever, you can come back in 5 minutes and see that it's decreasing or back to 0, which is kind of cool. So really quickly in IE, so if I click on F12, that brings up my developer tools, IE 11. In this case, you have it in 10 as well. So I'll go ahead and hit play, do a refresh of my site. And you'll see that all this stuff starts downloading, right? Hopefully soon. And this will change, again, based on where you are, based on what the bandwidth of that environment is at that given time, based on the current usage of that pipe. So if it's lunchtime, it might be really slow. If it's 8 a.m. Monday morning, it might be really high. So you can then click on, let's say, details, response headers, SP, request. Okay, wait a minute. It's in here somewhere. Yeah. Somehow I'm jumping back 100 some pages. We're not going to do that. Hold on, let's try this. I'm not saying the experience is always fun. One more time. And then I'll just eat my Office 365 hat. Okay. There we go. Okay, so there's my SP request durations. That's my response time. So that's the number that I'm going to want to try to decrease. But that also is dictated by the size of the page, right? This page has a lot of stuff going on. It's got Yammer calls. It's got a bunch of sliding images that are being pulled down as well. I'll skip the intermediate demo, but same demo, same SharePoint site, but less information on it. In theory, I've actually seen it in a couple of different ways. This should come back with a lower SP request duration, if I can actually keep a session going. Yeah, well, that didn't work out so well. I think it's because it timed out or whatever. But, in theory, this should go down to, 5, 10, 30 at the most that I've seen it when I was going through this test. So this is at least a way to see, okay, based on where I am, based on what the page is, start going through that mimification process of compressing files, compressing information to make sure that the response time is the fastest that you can actually get it. Hopefully, in that fire hose of information, you guys have at least come away with some sort of understanding of how you can use SharePoint Online as a pseudo stretch farm. It's not true stretch farm anymore. I don't think most people are going to be doing that anymore anyway, unless you just are going point-to-point local or something like that. If you have any questions, please hang out. I don't know if the next speaker's here yet. If he is, we'll get off the stage. But if you have questions, otherwise, thanks for having me. Hope you guys have a great week and enjoy. Thanks.